Please join me in welcoming from Texas A&M University, Dr. Brian McCullough. Brian is an associate professor of sport management at Texas A&M. His research focuses on sport and the natural environment, and he has published over 80 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters. Brian has contributed to the formation of the United Nations Sports for Climate Action Framework, and he currently serves as the co-director of the Sport Ecology Group, the director of the Center for Sport Management Research and Education, and the Laboratory for Sustainability in Sport. Please welcome Brian McCullough. Come on up, Doc. Prefer to hold this? Okay, great.
All right. Thank you for sticking around. As was said, my name is Brian McCullough, and I'm an associate professor at Texas A&M University, where I got my master's and Ph.D., and I'll kind of get into that here in a little bit. But over the past 14 years, as it was said, I've been focusing my research on sport and the natural environment. And what I would like to talk about today will really echo what has been said in the earlier sessions today, and hopefully will reverberate throughout the rest of this conference. And so it's a great honor to be here, and it's kind of a sort of a homecoming for me to be able to be here. But today I would like to reiterate again what was said. And so climate change impacts the sports and the athletes and participants in the places that we love. So let's go on to the next slide, please. And so just kind of give a little bit of a personal background. Like I said, this is sort of a homecoming for me. I grew up in California, and the first picture up there is a picture with my dad and my sister. I don't know, my brother may have been counting all the fish that he caught that day, but regardless, my dad really taught us a real love for nature, and especially when you can see this integration within sport. And so we had a very fortunate opportunity to go on vacation in Lake Tahoe, where again, these environmental lessons were probably said more inadvertently than he would have intended. And so what we really taught, what he taught us, was that the forests around Lake Tahoe were part of second generation growth because of the deforestation of the timber in that area because of the development in the Bay Area in California. And so what you saw was that environmental interventions work. And so as I proceeded on, and like I said, it was a homecoming for me because I went to Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York. And as they would say, Ithaca is utopia surrounded by reality. And so while I was there, I had a great opportunity to be able to really learn more about the natural environment and learn about sport business. And that was kind of planting the seeds for my future career as a researcher. And this last picture here on the far right is a picture of our baseball field with Lake Cayuga in the background. So sport and the natural environment was always literally in the background of my playing career. And so this bottom picture here, it just kind of shows, one, I'm a huge baseball fan, and I have a very understanding wife that's allowed us to get our engagement photos in front of my favorite, the ballpark of my favorite baseball team, the San Francisco Giants. And so, you know, as we kind of go through this process, you know, sport and the natural environment have always been integrated within me. And at Texas A&M, when I got down to Texas, you know, leaving the utopia of Ithaca, New York, and going into Texas and not seeing environmental sustainability really valued all that much, or at least explicitly valued, it really started to see this juxtaposition that we need to be able to integrate this. And this is really when the Green Sports Alliance was coming on board in 2010, that my research really started to take off because we started noticing the importance that sport and the natural environment have together. And that wasn't really discussed much in our research areas. And so my wife and I, we actually got married in Lake Tahoe, and in the church here, you can see the backdrop with the trees and the lake in the background behind the altar. And that Catholic faith that we have and share, we're able to teach our boys these environmental values and these social teachings that are so important to us, to our religion, but also to protecting the earth that we're called to protect and preserve. And so we've been able to pass those values on to our children here in that last picture of my beautiful family. Fortunately, my kids look like my wife, and they're so cute and all those lovely things. But all that to be said, this is kind of the background to just kind of give you this platform to saying that as an athlete, I see this connection. And going into upstate New York, I never would have thought that baseball would have been a winter sport coming from California, but training in March, we would sometimes have snow outs, which was a whole brand new thing to me coming from there. So next slide here. And so as I went through my career, I was able to work with different researchers, and we coined the term sport ecology, which we dubbed to be the study of the bidirectional relationship between sport and the natural environment. And to kind of give you a look behind the curtain within academia, we were fighting for space within our academic journals to be able to say, again, this is a worthwhile research line that needs to be explored and needs to be legitimized within our field. Because without a healthy environment, our industry and our research wouldn't exist. And so we were able to coin this term, and so then we were able to save pages upon pages in our journal articles rather than justifying why this research is important. We could simply point to this term, but it certainly has taken off. As was said in my introduction, I'm the co-director of the Sport Ecology Group, and with that position, we have the privilege of being able to advance and make our research accessible to practitioners. And so it's not just sitting on the shelf and we're writing for journal articles' sake. We're actually influencing the way that the industry is working so that we can protect the natural environment and preserve our sports. Next slide, please. And so what sport ecology really examines, again, is the impacts that sport has on the natural environment. As was said, sport does, through transportation and people coming to different sporting events, has that impact. And what this picture here illustrates is the fact that we can customize our landscapes, right? And we're adjusting sport and adjusting nature to meet the needs of sport. And as was kind of talked about, that tension between sport and the way that we're adapting our facilities or perhaps even adapting our sports. And so this picture, I think, is very emblematic of the ways that sport is impacting the natural environment, especially within golf. And so you can see here this golf course is being built and constructed in the valley between two mountains, most likely using grasses that are not native to that specific area, requiring more water use, more pesticides, more fertilizers, and things like that. And so this is a great picture to exemplify the ways that sport impacts the natural environment. But we can also consider, if anyone's ever been to a tailgate coming from Texas, where football is king, that is crazy amounts of waste that are being generated. And people converging upon a city that may not be able to completely absorb the environmental impact that comes with it. And there's this juxtaposition of what we need to consider with the environmental impact, with the economic impact, and the decisions that we need to have moving forward. So on the next slide, we can also see that there's environmental impacts on sport. And so while sport itself has impacts on the natural environment, and to kind of put this in perspective, there's a researcher at the University of Colorado, Roger Pilkey. He notes that the environmental impact of the global sports sector is roughly about 6 minutes of China's overall global carbon emissions, or annual carbon emissions. Now, granted, China is the most populous country in the world, and then also the biggest carbon emitter, but it really does put sport into perspective. And so while in our kind of academic debates, there are some people that will vilify sport and saying that sport needs to do better. I agree with that. We need to do better and to reduce our emissions and reduce our impact on the natural environment because of our innate and intimate relationship with the natural environment. But it's also important to realize that, we are going to go engage in sport, recreation, and physical activity in the natural environment, and that will have an impact. But it's not just by living our daily lives and being physically active shouldn't necessarily be vilified. So on the flip side, the environment also impacts sport, and this picture here has been circled around early this year and in 2023 about the impacts that the heat wave across Europe has had on the ski industry. And granted, it's a beautiful day, again, very reminiscent of my time here in upstate New York, seeing the snow fall and land on the trees, very, very beautiful. But this is not normal obviously, for Europe and the ski industry there. And as was said in the opening session, that this is going to impact the economy, impact jobs, the livelihood of many, many people. And so what we see here is that we have this snow trail, and the snow trail leading us hopefully to specific changes. And so the increased temperature specifically for winter sport is apropos for this conference and setting, and frankly is destroying and threatening sports. We now have endangered sports, and winter sports is the most endangered of those all. And I'm not trying to have a doom and gloom talk here, but it's something that's necessary to be able to address and address that elephant in the room. And so these increased temperatures are causing heat-related illnesses and even deaths amongst athletes in summer and fall sports in regions like my current state of Texas, where even it was 80 degrees Fahrenheit the day I left to come up here, which our air conditioning was kicking on, which is absolutely absurd to think about, especially 2 years ago when we had the great freeze in Texas. But these increased temperatures also prevent snow and result in rain on mountains, which is then presenting new problems that our sports are engaging with and needing to adapt to. As a result, these impacts, humans are adapting to continue their employment of sport and their enjoyment of engagement with these different activities as well. As I noted before, if we're unaware of these impacts, we really need to be able to address that elephant in the room and be able to make sure that we're moving forward. Next slide, please. And so, again, going back to our engagement photo, again, because my wife's very understanding, but this photo is really juxtaposed and really hit home the impacts, even though researching this topic of sport in the natural environment really hit home for me during the wildfires in Northern California, where this picture on the top was taken at 2 in the afternoon in San Francisco, which should have been a bright, clear day, or maybe even the fog rolling in that day. But instead, because of the wildfires just north of San Francisco, the poor air quality resulted in a cancellation of baseball games, and very ironically, the sky was orange, just like the picture of one of the San Francisco Giants colors. And so what we see here is that sport is really starting to be threatened in many other ways. Not just our participation in it, but our consumption of sport in other ways as spectators. And so as we're looking at this, and yes, we do look at sport as a business and how we're going to be able to move forward, these are active considerations, again, not as a direct result. These wildfires were not as a direct result of sport itself, but of human activity resulting in wildfires. And so, when you look at this picture on the bottom again, and then, I won't say how many years later, but many years later, we see the wildfires really impacting this. This, to me, really hit home. And that's one of the things that we look at in our research is really trying to make sure that we make climate change very relevant to the individual to cause change. Because if they do not see that this will impact them, understanding and studying human behavior, which can sometimes be scary, humans are sometimes very, very selfish. That might be some news to you, but also not surprising to others, right? But humans are very selfish, so they don't see how this relates to them, they won't act. And so if we're able to show and make this connection, we're able to have some positive impacts. And that's what some of the work that we're doing in contributing to the National Climate Assessment, which is the U.S. version of the IPCC report. We're now starting to relate and trying to show research and relate that back to individuals, showing how their favorite sports, their recreational activities like fishing and hunting will be threatened because of climate change and how we're going to have to adapt in that specific way. Next slide, please. So we have a very intimate connection with sport. As was said here within the specific region here, my love for the upstate New York and Ithaca specifically, but within this region, people will have a very intimate connection, place identity, as we would refer to it. And so we have this intimate connection, whether, again, from place or through sport. And so as we engage in sport, there's obviously endorphins that are released in our brains as we exercise, and there's a chemical addiction that we can get with physical activity and sport. As well as engaging in nature, it increases well-being, and there's very much clear research that shows the positive benefits of engaging within nature and specifically with sport. And so as we kind of start to gain this deeper connection with sport, our social identity starts to change. And this social identity can be extremely powerful, and again, trying to convey these messages of climate change and the importance there to be able to have positive climate action, not only in the sports, recreational activities, and physical activity that we do engage in nature, but also in everyday aspects of our lives. But we are seeing, next slide please, kind of this severing of that connection. As we go into artificial environments, our distance becomes further and further from the natural environment. And there's a sociologist, Leslie Howe, sorry. Leslie Howe speaks to how many people that are engaging in nature sometimes use nature as a means to the end of their enjoyment of sport and recreation, rather than seeing nature as a means, or excuse me, as an end in and of itself. And so these are some great pictures back from the outdoor rink in hockey games at the outdoor rink here in Lake Placid, and then also the outdoor rink at the games, what was formerly known as Squaw Valley in Lake Tahoe. And so we had ice hockey outside, and what dedicated fans to show up to that, right? As a Californian, that just makes me feel really, really cold, right? And maybe these are just so dedicated fans because they were actually stuck on the stands, I don't know. But all that to be said, sport has really changed, right? And there's that tension that was mentioned in just the last session of we need to commercialize sport and make money off of it, or just to be able to survive. And it's not saying we're trying to make exorbitant profits, but we need to grow our sport and expand the connections that people have with it to be able to continue and have our sports survive just through participation alone. But now with the beautiful arena and retrofitted arena here in town, you can see, again, we're going into artificial environments, and we get further and further away from the natural environment. So there's organizations like Save Pond Hockey that are doing a phenomenal job of trying to reconnect people with nature while enjoying their sports. And the NHL has done a fantastic job of embracing outdoor games. And so when they do have the outdoor classic, they're being able to connect people again back with nature, being outside with sport. Because the NHL sees this, well, I would speculate, I do not know, this is not a direct quote from anyone within the NHL, but as an academic, I could speculate that the NHL sees this as a business proposition as well. That if we can protect winters, save our winters, we can then preserve outdoor hockey, and that's where people are learning the sport. And then we can create a pipeline, sorry, that may not be the best word, but we can create a positive way to be able to bring people into our sport, to be future fans, future players, and then also recruiting the next generation of players and fans as well. Next slide. And so there's consequences as a result of climate change. And so as you can see here in the picture, we have a snow gun that's here, and it's phenomenal to see that that technology is increasing, right? To make them more efficient, to ensure that our quality of sport and competition is safe and is at an extremely high level, right? And so we have this balance between adaptation because we need to, because of the result of lack of snow. Beijing obviously had some Beijing games, the winter games there, had some issues with regards and got some negative publicity because of the artificial snow that they used to produce the games. But if you look at their original bid, they mentioned that most of the snow would be artificially made. But all that to be said, there's adaptations, and adaptations are okay. But we need to make sure that they're done in a sustainable way, and that was so great to hear in the last session about how that technology has advanced so that we can be more efficient, using less water, using less kilowatt hours to power those guns. But we also see this changing where, again, referring back to hockey, we see a lot of rinks that are indoors, but then we also had outdoor rinks where it would be a practice rink. And in these situations, we're starting to see different other social issues rearing its head yet again, where there's researchers up in Canada that did a study on climate adaptations at Canadian hockey rinks, and they found that girls' teams were more likely to get bumped because of scheduling conflicts than boys' teams were. And so we can see this intimate connection between sport, and the natural environment, and social issues, again, rearing its head as a result to climate change. And so these are all different things that we need to actively consider and look at as we're adapting. Other aspects and consequences of this is that we're having less ski days, as mentioned. And each passing year, we're losing more and more ski days and season days there. And more and more ski resorts are also closing due to financial constraints with a result of the pressures, financial pressures to adapt and install ways to survive. But then also we're making sometimes winter sports less accessible, more expensive because of these upgrades. So these are all active things to consider. And again, it was great to hear of the ways that that is being addressed here in Lake Placid and hopefully can be a model in other places. Next slide. And so again, we see these consequences. And again, going back to that hockey example, is that once we move to artificial environments, those become very expensive. Again, being a native Californian, I was not really exposed to too many winter sports, despite Lake Tahoe, again, in our background. We would go for summer sports and things like that. But what we saw when I was in Bowling Green, after I graduated with my Ph.D. and worked at Bowling Green State University, was the expense that comes with ice time. And again, the expenses that come with playing a sport that so many people love and already has some cost entry issues to the sport itself. And so as we kind of move from outside natural environments to indoor artificial environments, we're becoming, again, further away from our sport, losing that connection, but then also on top of that, making it less accessible to so many other people. And so we can go to the next slide. And that brings us back to our intimate connection with sport. And social identity created between us as individuals and a sport can extend to many other nodes and connections. For example, the collective social identity of a fan or a team for a team, or like here with the women's national Canadian team. But then also on top of that, the small community that we can create within a cross-country skiing club. Right? These connections can be very, very powerful. Not only are we creating friendships, but we're creating intimate connections with the people and also with nature during that time. And so it creates values and expected behavioral norms as well that can be really leveraged. And these are tremendously powerful in influencing individual behaviors. Time and time again, the research has been showing that people are influenced by those that are around them and mimicking behaviors of those that are around them. So it's very important to be a champion for the change that you want to see. For example, we can leverage the love of, again, the women's Canadian hockey team among fans to engage in behaviors that, by simply stating the Canadian women's hockey team says that you need to do this, and people will follow suit because the women's national Canadian, or the Canadian national hockey team says to do whatever. And so we've worked with Carlin before as the sustainability director for the USA Special Olympic Games in Seattle before she was in her role now at the Games here. And we leveraged this connection with the Special Olympics, people's connection with the Special Olympics, to influence their behavior and to understand their values and their needs. And so we were able to create campaign messaging and then target individuals to encourage them to use public transportation during their visit and stay in Seattle for the Special Olympic Games. In a pre-event survey, we found out that 78% of respondents were expecting to rent a car during their time in Seattle. Then the campaign was launched, and it was extremely successful. And the campaign was all focused on the walkable games. That was the theme. You can use public transportation to get to, I believe, all but 2 facilities. Your hotel, the opening and closing ceremony venue, and all the other venues except for 2, the natatorium and I think maybe the baseball field, I can't remember exactly, were not accessible on public transportation, or the light rail specifically. And then in a post-event survey, we found that only 7% of people actually rented a car during that time. So, again, as an academic, I would say the collaboration between practitioners and academics can be very beneficial and very fruitful. And it was extremely successful campaign that Carlin launched, the Walkable Games campaign. And so we were able to use and leverage that connection again with the Special Olympics. The Special Olympics is telling you to do X, Y, and Z, to take mass transit, your pass that you get, and there's this educational component, as was mentioned also in the previous sessions. that awareness and education can really encourage positive behavior. Yet I might be speaking to the choir here in this room. And in another example, we found that football fans of two collegiate sport teams, football teams, in two different contexts, a very progressive campus and a very conservative campus, and you can guess what conservative campus it may have been, exhibited the same responses to environmental messages when it was framed through the team itself. That the team at X university is telling you to do this. People will follow suit. Of course, there will always be naysayers, and there always will be people that are saying, finally, thank goodness you're finally doing something for the natural environment. But that what we are seeing time and time again is about that middle chunk ranges anywhere from 60 to 80% of a fan base. And they're just saying, just tell me in a practical way why I should do this. And if the team, again, you can leverage team identification, saying, as a hypothetical, I'll just say that, as a hypothetical, if Texas A&M said, you need to recycle more or throw away your waste more responsibly when you're tailgating, Aggies will follow suit. We can tap into core values of the social identity as being an Aggie, or if it was at LSU, or even more progressive campuses like UC Colorado, or UC Boulder, and UC Berkeley, and campuses like that. We are able to tap into that identification, and it can really be leveraged. Where people might be restrictive and not even open to messages in other aspects of their life. As was said too, sport can be apolitical. And in this context, environmental sustainability can be extremely political and outside of sport. But within sport, again, people are very open to those aspects. So the message doesn't have to say explicitly that we are going to save the environment. It doesn't have to, it can. But it will result in positive benefits to environmental behaviors. And what we have found through our research is that time and time again, if people are receiving these messages and it becomes a core value for that specific organization, whether it's tradition and leadership and excellence, core values at Texas A&M University, or whether it's just like, this is what we do as a campus. We are sustainable. We care about the natural environment, like it might be at University of Colorado in Boulder. You're able to tap into these things, and people will integrate into that, and it will translate into their everyday life. And that's some of the projects that we had been working on before COVID hit with different sport teams in Seattle to leverage that public transportation, and saying that if they are able to take public transportation to a sporting event, they might realize, oh, this is actually really convenient. I don't have to sit in traffic on 5 all the time. I can actually take light rail into the city, and that translates into their everyday life and when they go into work or go to the theater or whatever they're doing in Seattle from outside. So the next slide. And so this really talks about the points of attachment. We talked about points of attachment with a specific sport, with a team, but athletes is really the prime driver here when it comes to points of attachment. And it's kind of like this hidden gold mine of being able to influence. And yes, athletes get a tremendous amount of pressure from different people to deliver the message, right? And we have to be careful that we're not exploiting athletes in this specific way, that they're authentic to themselves. But athletes ultimately have this specific connection, right? And so we have all these different nodes that come off of points of attachment. And from a business standpoint, whether it's, again, promoting a sport, participation in a sport, or the consumption of a sport as a participant or as a more passive spectator, all these attachments are very, very important. And again, I love that I was set up so well with the different panels here. And how do we deliver the message? Any way possible. And these are just 4 examples of different points of attachment that an individual in sport consumer behavior can have to a specific team or to a sport identity, right? This can come from the USOC, it can come from other organizations. But ultimately, we want to be able to deliver messages because they're going to be received differently by people. And this is why it's very important to be able to have a very specific understanding of our fans and our target audience to be able to influence their behaviors itself. But again, the most important there is at the top, and I put it at the top for a reason, because athletes have the biggest influence on fans because it's a personal connection, right? It feels like they're having this individual conversation between the athlete and the target audience. Whereas a coach doesn't necessarily have that. You can just simply look even at the followers that Ronaldo even has, despite all the recent issues, has on social media. Tremendously higher than any other sport team, right? So one message, right, that even moving a Coke bottle off of a table when he's being interviewed post-event had a tremendous influence and drew up so much controversy and conversation about that one action. Just imagine if we were able to engage athletes in the same way with regards to environmental sustainability, which we are starting to see with different organizations that are popping up. So next slide. We can really look at athletes, right? And here's the whole crux of the talk itself. Athletes have a tremendous opportunity to be able to engage in this, and this conversation will be had tomorrow in different sessions with Chris Dickerson. But all that to be said, athletes have a tremendous perspective, right? And we're hearing lots of conversations and comments from athletes that they have climate anxiety. And this is a really strong call for research in this specific space. This goes beyond what I do, but that others need to do this type of research because it's very important to understand the root causes of that anxiety. People are anxious that their sport isn't going to exist anymore. The IOC in some regards has acknowledged as such with the delay in choosing a location for the Winter Games and the changes in climate, and the future of the Winter Olympic Games is really in peril. But all that to be said, athletes have this prime experience. And so we need to understand their anxieties. Are they worried about their sport being lost? Or are they worried about being criticized online because they're traveling all over the place because of the result of climate change, that they have to go to very select places in the world to train? One of this beautiful areas being one of them. But we have to really look at that. But on top of that, they have that lived experience that they can provide, and a tremendous amount of experience and expertise that no one else can provide, right? That's why we, in some regards, want to access them, right? We want to hear the message from somebody. And so they're able to have this opportunity and to speak that truth from their lived experience. So they have firsthand experience to speak from that. And you should not be ashamed, these athletes should not be ashamed or think that they have a lack of legitimacy when delivering a message. Protect Our Winters, as kind of as shown here, has a tremendous philosophy when it comes to athlete activism. And there's no perfect activist, and that'll be talked about again tomorrow. So I encourage you to attend that session. But their philosophy to kind of foreshadow what might be talked about tomorrow really is saying, just go out there and engage in conversation. We'll give you basic information and make it your true, authentic message. We don't want a cookie-cutter message because that seems less authentic. Right? So we want to be able to have this aspect where you can speak to this. This is how climate change is impacting me in my training, in my competitions. This is the cost now it's causing me to go through these processes, and provide examples of what we're doing to improve and reduce our impact, but also, again, the challenges that climate change faces us. And so there's a tremendous opportunity, again, to leverage athletes. And we can do so by working hand in hand to be able to kind of show where there's possible movement, right? We can have the polarized sides on the very proactive side saying, thank goodness you're finally talking about this, right? If we deliver the message to those individuals, there's not much opportunity to change their behaviors even more. We can leverage those individuals on that upper end to be able to be advocates for us, to be additional messengers, to get the group that's in the middle. And that's where we found in our research where we can really start to move people into an area for climate action. Because if we can show them in a very practical way that this is why we're engaging in this is why you need to engage in this is why it's important to you, without being in their face, just matter-of-factly putting that forward, we can see really a lot of positive actions from there. And then, last but not least, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm happy to answer any questions. I understand we can kind of maybe glossed over a couple of things, but moved quickly through others. But happy to answer any questions that you have and engage in a conversation. Normally, I'm used to being like a free-range academic talking. Thanks for the wireless mic, but I kind of got bogged down here with the slides here on my computer. But all that to be said, happy to engage in conversation like we would in the classroom. So if there's any questions or anything like that, happy to take those.
Excuse me.
So it seems that you need to have something specific to ask teams or athletes to ask their fans to do. And I guess the question is, and when they do that, how far can they push people to go?
No, that's a great question. And so I'll bring up a couple examples. The Portland Trailblazers, NBA team based in Portland, Oregon, would have a campaign every year. So they would try to nudge people further and further. So it's a nudge. And having young children, you can have a nudge, but a nice guided hand could be really helpful. And I think the same analogy would work well with fans. But you don't want to be overburdensome where it seems like, oh, here's the next thing. Here's the next thing, right? But it's really trying to develop specific campaigns that relate to the specific region. So Portland was able to do a lot of waste management, right? So that's sometimes the first initiative that organizations and venues will engage in because it's very visible to spectators and fans that show up. So it's automatic, like, okay, this organization cares about the natural environment. Whether they recycle it or not, that's a whole different story, but here I fully believe that that's the case, but I've observed it in other areas where it's not. But then that's the first step. And in Portland, it really works well because they have a great public transportation system that they're able to promote that, encourage people to come to the game by public transportation. But in certain areas, certain campaigns wouldn't work. Despite Washington being in a drought, in the Seattle area specifically being in a drought, we found that fans would not resonate with water conservation campaigns. They're like, we live in Seattle, it rains all the time, right? Despite there being a drought there for that specific area, right? But it does work in Arizona, it does work in Texas, where we are experiencing a lot of drought. So those are the types of things that you need to consider. But then also on top of that, it's that nudging along the way, one thing after another, right? And I would recommend, based off of what we've seen, is getting different market segments into a specific range in that spectrum of finally you're doing something, right? And then once you have a critical mass in there, you might be able to move on to the next campaign and promote that way. Hopefully that answers your question. Oh, okay.
If I could borrow that for a second. I know for sure that Dr. McCullough is onto something very big. We've got just a couple of minutes, and I want to just pick your brain on this. In my world of television, I interact with athletes all the time, and they have the opportunity here in these interviews to message about their performance, their life, their experiences, and other things that are important to them. For about 5 seasons, I was covering Pac-12 football, and for those of you who are not familiar with American football, PAC stands for the Pacific. These are schools on the West Coast, and they had a thing called the Pac-12 Zero Waste Challenge. You familiar with that? So they were really working at basketball games and football games to encourage all the fans to see who could have the least amount of waste at the end of a game. And it was a competition. And the competition was started by the conference, the group of schools, and then it was messaged through each program and through the social media departments, and then through the athletes themselves out to the fans. And it was very powerful. I'm wondering your thoughts, again, as I was sort of alluding to earlier here this morning, how can we, again, empower the athletes, no matter the sport, and of course the ones who are here competing at this event, to take on the messaging that doesn't bludgeon fans over the head, but sort of encourages them and nudges them and gives them a particular goal that they feel like they can be a part of to help with sustainability?
Well, specifically within college sport, the college landscape has changed with a lot of NIL deals and things like that. So it's empowered athletes in a much more positive way, I would argue. There's still a lot of things that need to shake out there. But that gives the platform, especially as we saw during COVID, a lot of athletes were starting to use social media as a way because they weren't competing. They were training, but so they were able to talk about their personal lives. I think that provides a lot of an open door opportunity for them to start to talk about, again, these aspects of what's really important. I mean, how many of your student athletes are environmental science majors, right? And that's the type of thing, like, I'm learning about this. I am becoming an expert in this through my education, and now I'm starting to apply this into what I do as an athlete and who I am as an athlete, and that can be really tremendously helpful, just like the diet that you have, whether it's a vegan diet or whatnot, and the benefits that it has for the natural environment, but also your athletic performance.
Yeah, and once again, I'll just encourage everyone here in this room and those of you who are really in-depth in all these topics to continue to think about ways you can bridge the important data and information and messaging to the athletes so they can simplify it and get it out to the public and then become engaged and aware about what's going on, because these are critically important topics that we're dealing with, not just locally. You live in Texas, Texas A&M. I live in Dallas. We're about 3 hours apart. And 2 days ago, it was 80 degrees, right? It was, what, 26 Celsius or whatever it is? And that's the kind of thing we were dealing with. So if I got the translation to Celsius wrong, I apologize for that. But it was very hot in the middle of the winter. So there are a lot of things happening, and I think that Dr. McCullough, your information is really, really powerful, and I hope that you all continue to follow up on this, because the athlete engagement, that piece is huge, no question. Let's thank Dr. McCullough.
Appreciate it.